So I'm trying to intervene in the field of animal studies and Saresian scholarship. I'm really interested in trying to create a dialogue with the question of the social contract in animal-human relations and the possibility of an animal ethics and obligations, either from the social contract or moving away from the social contract into the language of contacts. That's why my R is in parentheses. So I'm going to be talking about animal contracts and animal contacts. And I may be able to explain following the fox if I have time. I'm not sure. So some background, since Brian's going to be talking extensively about Michel Serres' natural contract, I feel like this is not quite doing justice to the concept, but I think it's interesting to ask how in the natural contract, Serres is articulating kind of a new state of nature, one in which humanity weighs as much as planet Earth, and he calls for replacing parasitic relations with the Earth with symbiotic ones. And yeah, he builds on the model of the social contract as something that's not actually signed, and yeah, asks about how we can develop contractual relations with the Earth as a partner. And so instead of considering the land as a passive object or resources to be claimed, Serres arguing in the early 1990s, well before the concept of the Anthropocene, the term Anthropocene is being used to name a new geological era, he is actually making exactly this argument, that the weight of humanity on the Earth can no longer be ignored, and humanity is leaving its traces within the Earth's geology. Now, there's been lots of critique of Serres' natural contract, thinking of Luc Ferry dismissing it as just a kind of fluffy concept that's imbued with American transcendentalism and German romanticism. I'm thinking of Pascal Bruckner's response about eco-guilt as being bound in the French Catholic tradition, and Bruckner embracing this kind of hedonistic, I love driving my car, so leave me alone. My own take on Serres' natural contract is that it is a métaphore filée, an extended metaphor that's part of the new stories. We need to be telling ourselves about obligations imagined as attachments to the Earth that tighten and loosen depending on the situation in which we find ourselves. So he uses illustrations such as a boat tied to the dock, mountain climbers strapped to a cliff face. This is not a set of universal rights and regulations. So Serres does not articulate the role of animals more specifically in the natural contract. They go largely unmentioned in Le Contrat Naturel, in the book itself, nor does he outline in detail a separate animal contract. So why am I proposing this topic for a conference on the ideology of nature and the social contract? Well, first of all, I feel like the animal is missing from this title. I think it can be seen as a kind of missing link between nature and society, or it's been articulated that way, sometimes situated more on the side of nature, thinking of Lynn Margulis's Symbiogenesis, or more Tennyson's Tooth and Claw, or Spencer's Survival of the Fittest, or in Michel Serres' own writing about the parasite. Or animals can be situated more on the side of society. If we look at recent anthropological work, thinking of Mark Beckhoff, thinking of Vance de Waal, animals as having a kind of proto-morality, or just maybe less precocious in claims that crows teach each other to use tools, that animals have culture already, elephant rituals of mourning, different kinds of cross-species friendship. So that's my first reason for talking about the animal, or animals. Second of all, Michel Serres' writing contains a surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, given how prolific a writer he is, a large number of animals: foxes, tigers, wolves, lambs, doves, ants, lions, rats, gorillas, horses, elephants, bulls, vipers, hummingbirds, cod, lions, whales, vultures, blue jays, coyotes, cougars, tarantulas, cows, chickens, crabs, dolphins, octopi, to name a few. That's not all of them. I also believe that animals are key to his theorizing about hominization and his storytelling practices, both in terms of his personal encounters with animals on the West Coast. He taught at Stanford in California for quite a while, and then he often talks about his experiences in southern France near the Garonne. Also hikes in national parks in the US, Yellowstone, and again, these childhood memories of living on a farm. And third reason I am bringing animals into the discussion is because of a couple texts I read recently that are attempting, kind of texts within political philosophy, to use the social contract theory and extend it to animals. So I'm thinking of Claire Palmer's 1997 article, The Idea of the Domesticated Animal Contract. She ultimately argues against this idea because animals cannot be seen as consenting to the conditions in which they live, and they cannot go back. Evolutionary changes are permanent, according to Palmer. And also Wayne Gabarty's The Next Social Contract, Animals, the Anthropocene and Biopolitics, that's 2017, a little more recent. And he argues that we need to radically rethink our basic ethical outlook and develop a new, more than human social contract. And he does this by first redefining the state of nature as one of climate change and Anthropocene, and then adopting a posthumanist understanding of the social as human, and he creates this concatenation, human-animal, co-evolutionary communitarianism. That's his understanding of the social. So in this first section, I want to ask how and if we can speak of animal-to-animal contracts. So this is not about human social contracts that include animals, but instead asking whether animals can include contracts between themselves. Now, they don't speak, they don't write, well, not in the kind of traditional conventional terms. But I think what we can find in Sarah's work is actually a kind of how do animals exist outside of human societies? Do we see them as like this kind of state of animals as a kind of nature tooth and claw, survival of the fittest? And I think there's two ways that Michel Serres work. And again, I think he's trying to avoid the problem of origins, to not go back to a specific origin point for the social contract, and try to kind of multiply, or if we use like a Derridian term, multiply the abyss or the ruptures between animals and humans. So we can't go back and just say this is this one moment in time. But I think he kind of argues both for continuity and rupture with the social contract, where he talks about animal-to-animal contracts. So first, he speaks of animals who are caught in Darwinian law. And I quote from Omniscience, and Omniscience is part of a trilogy, Omniscience, Rameau, and Récit d'Humanisme, in which he is describing human evolution as a form of de-differentiation. So he's describing animals here. Locked up in the intersubjective, in the prisons of coevolution, animals have no object, only a Lebenswelt, a vital world of niches and prey. Hence their imprisonment in the time of the struggle whose mortal cruelty Darwin himself mourned. So here we see Sartre placing animals on the side of the state of nature. No animal contracts are possible. It's a question of survival of the fittest. Animals have no choice, no consent. It's a struggle of all against all. Feels like a very Hobbesian nature. And animals are evolving, but they always remain on the other side of culture. And then he gives a second explanation of how maybe it's less a question of rupture between animals and humans, and more one, so a difference in degree and not kind. And he actually articulates in his discussion with Bruno Latour and Éclaircissement, he speaks of the animal contract. And this is where, Chris, I really enjoyed your, it was inspired by your discussion of this section of Sarah's thinking about a kind of continuity between animals and humans. And you give some great examples of kind of wild animals snarling at each other, moving, living together, and then they don't. So I'm quoting here from Serres. Chimpanzees, baboons, termites, or beavers. Animals constantly conclude purely social contracts with each other. Empty, exclusively based on the we. The lightness of these conventions forces them to contract them in real time, continuously. This is well defined. The despondency strictly political into which animal societies find themselves plunged. Humanity begins with the heaviness of the object, from which the new social contract receives a heaviness, whose density opens up an unforeseen story, other than the repetition of the same convention. So again, here kind of you have this continuity and rupture in the same quote. And I finish the quote: our contracts, human contracts, are caused by things. Without them, we would have remained political animals, end quote. So animal contracts can be imagined as a simplified, lighter, impermanent form of the social contract. but then some kind of break or rupture is required to arrive at humanity, a social contract in which objects create relationality. And this made me think of actually Thomas Nile, your talk about the role of cattle, and animals are playing this role of objects, I think, in this the Yamnayas peoples, the problem of them being stolen, they're not treated as subjects in of themselves. So we might ask why animals would even need contracts between themselves. And this is, if we think of contracts as a form of relationality or communication, receiving and storing information about other creatures in their social environments, I think it resonates really well with Gregory Bateson's work in Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And I'm not going to go into great depth, but he has this great description of two dogs who are at play, and they're nipping at each other's ears as they play. And he argues that this is a form of, it's a meta communication that's saying this is play, this is not a bite. And that's a kind of play, interactive behavior that includes communication, and that also means that when the dogs come back together again later in time, they have this kind of memory of this previous play of saying to one another, this is still play, or we're doing another kind of play, but it's not a bite. So thinking of the example of dogs and the influence of humans on animal contracts, I want to move into the kind of ways in which domestication can be thought of as a kind of animal-human contract. And is it that kind of through domestication, these simplified contracts that Serge is talking about became more permanent? And how do we articulate that role of humans? Is it that on the one hand, you have humans with their own social contracts amongst themselves, and then animals have their own simplified form? Or is it rather that the social contract emerges through this form of domestication? So if we're thinking about the passage from the state of nature to society, and the benefits and losses to animals, Steve Budiansky actually argues that domestication can be seen in terms of animals' choice to live in close proximity with humans. So the animal contract is created kind of through this process of domestication, and animals do have a choice in it. They consent to living with human beings, and they receive the benefits of protection and food. But this contract ends when life for domesticated animals is worse than living in the wild. And we can then maybe start to ask kind of which domesticated animals we're talking about. The contemporary treatment of factory farmed animals, clearly the losses outweigh the benefits massively. Thinking about pets, it's a little more complicated. But we could argue that pets don't actually have the choice of leaving the home, although cats are different from dogs. J. Baird Cattle also argues for this idea of a co-domestication that can be seen as an evolved and unspoken social contract, he calls it, and that can be broken by mechanization and depersonalization of domesticated animals. In terms of Serre's understanding of domestication, at times he seems to argue for a form of co-domestication. He finds examples of symbiotic relationships between humans and animals in life he knew growing up on a farm. And then he extrapolates from this experience a kind of more general theory about how domestication taught humans how to live in a kind of sociality. And for Serre, it was the fact that animals and humans lived under the same roof that created this sense of a larger extended family. So cows and sheep and chickens were not on the side of nature or on the side of culture. Instead, Serre speaks of this family nature distinction. So animals are placed and humans are on the side of family and not on the side of nature. And he calls this une sorte de symbiose originale, à vie partagée. So what this might mean for wild animals, Serre does not say. They could very well still be living in what he calls the despondency, the strictly political, in which animal societies find themselves plunged. But to come back to Claire Palmer's critique of the idea of the domesticated animal contract, She argues that it's a way of naturalizing the domination of animals. She says that, in fact, the liberties that animals give up to cohabit with humans was never a question of, never an issue of consent, and they can never go back. But I think a really interesting response can be found in one of Serre's reading of La Fontaine's Fables. For Serre, La Fontaine's Fables lay out an ethology and not, in fact, a set of morals. And it's an ethology that explains how animals and humans came to live together. So in the fable Le Loup et le Chien, he uses the lens of domestication to ask what an animal has to give up in order to live with humans. I'm not going to read the fable for you, but if you want, while I'm discussing it, go right ahead. So Serre introduces the notion of an equilibrium point in the processes of becoming, when the wolf dog consults the dog wolf about becoming dog or becoming wolf. In other words, he does not oppose the free wolf to the domesticated dog, but instead imagines both animals as temporary stoppages in the flux of social relations and material conditions. At the same time, he recognizes the sacrifices that are made by both animals. Their bodies carry traces of their types of relationships. The wolf's hunger in the predatory prey relations, and the mark of the dog's collar on his neck in the case of parasitism. And I have a quote from, not from Serre's posthumously published text La Fontaine, but instead from an article that appeared in Critique in the 1990s, Peut-on dire le pouvoir spirituel? Driven by hunger, the wolf here is already a dog. Thirsty for freedom, the dog here is already a wolf. And because they can transform into each other, they can know each other, have a relationship with each other. Even before speaking, they are co-born. They are born complementary. They are born reciprocally. They contract between them a pact of rebirth, a sort of natural contract, I would say animal contract. This last word saying, better still, this rebirth decided together. I think what the example of the wolf and dog illustrates is that animal-animal contracts are already including the human as a third. The dog's master is the unspoken figure in this fable. And this is why Claire Palmer would respond that animals actually never give free consent. We're always bound to the human. I'm going to skip this next bit. Okay, so I guess basically the other key just kind of question to me is the social contract tradition actually appropriate for exploring the possibility of human-animal relations? And it's come out, just quickly quote Palmer, for her, the language of the animal contract, implying as it does some kind of consent or agreement, serves to legitimate the power which humans have acquired over domestic animals. Power just not over their conditions of existence, but over their natures, and power which, with recent developments in biotechnology, become increasingly absolute. So kind of this notion that's embedded the ideology of the social contract as well of humans as rational, autonomous consent giving, this kind of liberal humanist construct is particularly problematic for Palmer. As for Serre, I think he actually anticipates the possibility of needing to put an end to that language of contracts and of animal contracts when he says, and I quote again from Peut-on dire le pouvoir spirituel, "We had previously abandoned the family in the rural sense in the classical scholarly community. We are now renouncing the exclusive status of subjects. We mix. We are moving forward in a new idea of democracy where others than us are welcomed, but differently than in the barn or the zoo, differently than in a jar, in a lab or a greenhouse. We no longer lock them in by inviting them. No one intervenes, neither them on us nor us on them, leaving everyone free in their relationships and inventing relationships between these two networks," end quote. So in this last section, I want to introduce the idea of animal contacts instead of animal contracts. And then hopefully during the discussion, we can maybe say kind of where does the contact, where does it happen? Does it sit outside of contractual language? But the word contact, coming from kind of the early Latin contactus, from touched, grasped, bordered on, plus the con, so the with. So together with, touching. And this reminds me again of Bateson's example of the two dogs playing together in the role of touch. So in this section, I want to move away from contractual language to a language of embodied agency. And this really is what emerges in Serre's own personal anecdotes, whether he's narrating an encounter with a cougar on a West Coast trail north of San Francisco, and then he's fleeing. No, rather than fleeing, actually, his response to the cougar's presence is to make himself appear bigger, parading, posturing, acting like a more powerful predator to scare away the cougar. Or whether he's swimming in the Galapagos Islands and approached by a sea lion and learns to dance with her, exchanging form of gestural greetings. These are not animals caught in Darwinian law, nature red tooth and claw. Instead, this is a form of contact, two bodies moving together, reading each other's signs in the moment. Not something that could be abstracted or conceptualized or theorized. It is this is kind of Serre's take on these interactions with animals. It's a way of thinking about knowledge in the body, not as two human figures fighting, as in the painting in Goya's painting, but as a choreography. And I quote, "The animal teaches us that knowledge is born with the appearance of the body, muscles, shape, gestures, and movements," end quote. And this, for me, echoes the model for human relations in the Anthropocene that Jamie Lorimer is trying to explain or describe in Wildlife in the Anthropocene, Conservation After Nature. She, and I quote, speaks of multi-species processes of learning to be affected by the experience of animals as affective agents whose life worlds exude corporeal, aesthetic, and ecological charisma. She speaks of learning to be more receptive to the visceral and emotional epiphanies of up-close animal encounters, to experience the jouissance of wildness. Now, the problem with such animal contacts, they have no institutional reality. They're based on experiential individual encounters, and the animal must have some sense of autonomy. They must be free to engage or not. In the examples in Serre's anecdotes about sea lions and cougars, these are animals in the wild, they're not pets. And what about urban wildlife? Moreover, Serre's not actually touching these animals. So I'm using the term following as in following their lead during a momentary encounter. I think a much more interesting take on the types of contact and following that are possible in urban settings and with pets can be found in Baptiste Morisot's On the Animal Trail. There's a much more sustained reflection on embodied relations with cats, or earthworms, also wolves. So this leads me to my conclusion. So following the fox. What do I mean by following the fox? Yes, this is in part echoing Jacques Derrida in L'animal que donc je suis à suivre. So the animal that therefore I am following, or I'm following to follow. But I'll start by the fox bit. So in Écrivains savants philosophes font le tour du monde, Michel Serres writes, I shamelessly admit as a teenager, the Scouts gave me the personal totem of enthusiastic fox. Actually, this was an honor because I adore this animal and cherish the intimate gods. But I also held another collective totem. Although a fox, I belonged to the Tiger Patrol for many years. So I wanted to think about my own individual encounters. When I was first thinking about this paper, I gave a very different version when I was in Dresden in November. I actually was walking to my conference talk and turned my head, walking by a very small urban park, and a fox appeared. So I felt I had to follow that fox. So very literally, I went into the park and tried to find its trail, figure out how it had gotten there. But again, so the kind of possibilities of urban encounters and the idea of following as a coming after. And I guess not just coming after in a kind of temporal sense, but as a way of thinking propositionally or relationally. I think I'm trying to get that across in my paper, that the following can be understood as après. It can also be understood as à partir de, so from, thinking from the animal. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what other frameworks, if we're following the animal in the Derridian sense, we're following the animal in the in the temporal sense, if we're kind of looking back into our own encounters with animals, what is there a kind of ethical framework that's possible around that? So thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Stephanie. It's a wonderful sort of cornucopia of thoughts for us to engage with. I'm reminded of the Apostrophe episode with Bernard Pivot that was filmed at Stanford with Serre and René Girard, where Serre says that Girard is the hedgehog, sort of burrowing into one particular idea incessantly, and he, Serre himself, is the fox who's sort of ranging around over many, many different
I actually have not watched that, but I will absolutely. Is it available online?
I think so. I think it's on ina.fr. And it's Isaiah Berlin's distinction originally, I think, between the hedgehog and the fox.
The hedgehog knows one thing.
That's right.
The fox goes all over.
Many things.
It knows many things.
That's right.
Relatively superficial.
Okay.
As you know, his distinctions are. Okay, so I don't have a well-formed question, and I've never read Serre, although now I feel like I will, because this is very interesting. But I liked your sort of description of, instead of contract, maybe contact. And I kind of wanted to ask about this idea in relation to Derrida that you end the paper with, because I was thinking about Derrida's description of when he steps out of the shower and his cat's looking at him, and he feels his nakedness and he feels shame.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, is that contact? Because it, in a sense, it maybe it is, because he's, you're reacting to another presence. But in another sense, the shame is really about Derrida, not about the cat. So I guess,
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think what's really interesting for me in this encounter between Derrida and his female cat, Une Petite Chatte, is this kind of gendered, how is his nakedness, how is it felt as shame, not just because it's a cat, but because it's a female cat. And there's a great article written by Carla, what's her last name again, about why Derrida feels so much shame, that it's not just about. So I actually don't think this is an example of contact. When I'm thinking about following the animal, it's more, Derrida doesn't really respond. I agree, it's about him and his shame. He doesn't ask, not in this particular piece, like, does his cat actually want to be stuck in the bathroom with him? Like, does the cat have this possibility of moving about? Does it want to be staring at? Like, those questions don't come into this particular, that section of L'animal que donc je suis à suivre. But then the next, he has this whole section on Lacan and Lacan's understanding of the animal as simply reacting and instinctual. And so I didn't get to this, but I do want to think about contact in terms of a response ability, like to what extent are we able to respond? What kind of responses can we take? But also when we talk about response ability, it moves away from obligations to how the body is moving. And so the animal can have a response ability as well. And that I find much more interesting that he does than kind of this, reflections on his own shame that he's feeling. I actually think it's kind of a missed contact. It's an encounter, but without him, not in that moment, at least, not in that moment. It's when he's like arguing with Lacan that you get more thought about this kind of how contact can lead to a responsibility, and then reflecting on how the animal is responding. And I mean, I read and reread that bit on encountering the cat and his own nakedness, and whether the cat kind of, that deconstruction of being naked and knowing that one is naked. And I feel like saying, but like, just pay a little more attention to what your cat is doing besides just looking at you. But no, I mean, it's something that Donna Haraway also gets really angry about with. I mean, she's just like, oh, come on, Derrida, like, you really love your cat, but you love yourself a lot too. Great question, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just quickly following up with the naked cat, naked man and the cat. That book kills. It's the only Derrida text every student remembers it. They remember the naked scene. They remember the Lacan everything else I teach by Derrida, maybe because I love Derrida, and, you know, I'm watching my pretty flower get killed every time, but that one, it slays. But I wanted to talk about the notion of responsibility. Actually, that brings me to a big distinction between, I think, Serres and Derrida, which is that, like, for Derrida, there is no responsibility, right? And contact, because in that moment, and I think he does return to that moment. He really plays with it. That's why we know the gender. That's why we know the shame. The things back Genesis and Adam's naming of the animals. He does do quite a bit of conceptual work there. He also does work in the last the 2002 lecture series where he comes back to this. But in any event, you know, he might say, like, well, something of, well, how much could I build in, right, without speaking and stepping in for that cat, which is where Serres assumes one can just cross that divide, and Derrida is more reticent. There is no ability. In other words, to say one has an ability to respond, one knows how to respond, right, and one is doing it correctly, and one knows one is responding, right, and these are vexing questions, right, and it's a question of alterity, right, and I think in the end, Derrida is what, questioning the human-animal distinction, surely, but also not denying its effects, but also not dismissing it, not deleting it, which is what a lot of people want to do, right? And that's not a good move either, right? Because we see that in biology, we see that in all biopolitics, the reduction of the human to the right. We end up with another, and so I just wanted to ask that about that moment where in fact actually Derrida on the notion of response and moments of contact that are not contact, right? Does that make sense? Or not?
You want me to talk about Derrida?
Well, maybe I'll talk about the Serres.
I'd rather not, but I could.
Serres is
Yeah.
the problem perhaps in Serres, and he's thinking of the animal and so on. Right?
Okay.
He has these very domestic and domesticated notions.
I think it comes down to two very different theories of language.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Because I think for Serres, the language can still become a very, I mean, if you think about the origins of language, for Serres, it's rooted in the noises of the world, it's rooted in the noises of animals. There's kind of like this continuity that he tries to articulate, whereas for Derrida, it's a rupture, it's a violence, it's a kind of stoppage. I mean, that wouldn't even be possible. So I think I would go back to the way that Serres uses language as a way of bringing the world alive again, where Derrida is caught in this, the process and methods of deconstruction. I think that would be my very short answer.
Thomas.
Good paper, thank you.
Thomas, and then Flora.
Thanks for your paper, Stephanie. That was I have so many thoughts, and I'm just trying to limit to kind of a question for you to think about, because I think and it's been a long time since I've read The Natural Contract. So if there's examples there, maybe this is a freebie, but I'm thinking about like other examples that aren't exactly so positive, or that we think about so positive in animal relations. I'm thinking about like hunting. I mean not just in a modern context, but like in a historical context, the relationship of following as tracking, traditions of relating to animals that result, not always, but often, in an animal being killed. You know, these aren't exactly very romantic descriptions of like, oh, I'm dancing with a sea lion, and you know, they're sort of coded more negatively, and it's not I mean, it's a really different historical and cultural context, and thinking about it. Derrida with his cat in his bathroom. I mean, it doesn't get more Parisian, you know, like it's a very urban context, but what about context outside of that? What about when the relations are essentially ones of conflict? Either we might also think about hunting where animals are hunting humans. It happens less often, of course, but you know, it's an important thing to think of. And if you've ever had the experience, you definitely remember a time where you were threatened directly by an animal. You know, like what happened? I mean, maybe is actually, you did give one example of the cougar, yeah. So where he feels like maybe he's being hunted. I was just wondering if you could speak about I guess the animal contact, which I really do like that idea, from kind of the other side. You know, like,
yeah, I guess
that animals themselves think about their contacts with us, you know, maybe in a very different way than we're like theorizing how we connect to them you know, they're connecting with us too, and most surely they don't think about it as a contract. You know, I mean, maybe when they're being dominated, they think something sneaky and terrible is happening, and they're probably right about that. But with respect to contact, I think that your examples are great. But I was wondering if you could give some maybe, I don't know, more diverse and consider some possibilities that Sarah doesn't think of, and one of those being hunting, because I don't think he goes hunting.
Not that I know of. He loves outdoor experiences, but not to. But I would argue that hunting is not necessarily negatively coded. I don't know what that, like, why would you say that hunting just because
I think maybe so I teach a class on animal ethics and philosophy and stuff, and students
but
really
I guess if I'm thinking of
it to that, and so I say that only from when this comes up. Like often there's just like, oh, hunting is like the worst possible thing, and then we have to work through the problem. But so anyway, I'm not saying you think
no, I'm just saying there's a lot of different forms of hunting. So this is one of the things that Baptiste Morisot takes up in On the Animal Trail. And basically he says that tracking can be a really close knowledge of an animal's past, present, and possible future. And it's a kind of eco-sensitivity that he describes. It's not about the hunting getting, you know, you pay a ton of money and someone takes you in a Jeep and they line the lion up and you shoot in the lion's dead. And that, I mean, so I guess when you say hunting, I would say that there are absolutely kind of this impossibility for the contact I'm trying to describe. Versus something that, in fact, if contact is about forms of communication, that as you're following the animal signs, as you're really carefully trying to reconstruct their worlds, you're kind of slightly transformed into them, depending how far down, like if you're looking at scats or if you're just looking at the broken branches, right? You have to kind of get down to other levels. You have to kind of see the world through the eyes of, or through the nose or the smell, if only. We can't smell anything. Any sense of smell is just terrible in human beings. But anyway, that's a whole different story. But I would say that there's absolutely all these possibilities of animal contact in hunting. And on the question of being prey, I think that's exactly the kind of reversal of human-animal boundaries that is needed to kind of move us away from dualistic thinking. Val Plummer, she's an ecofeminist, Australian ecofeminist. Maybe you've read her story. I mean, her account of being pulled under by the crocodile and being in an animal role. And this is contact for me. I mean, this is visceral, close. This is not like romanticized. Yeah, well, there are definitely part of contact is being killed. Or the possibility, and taking seriously that possibility of being killed. I just did Grizzly Man, Werner Herzog's documentary with my students last week, and Timothy Treadwell is eaten by a grizzly at the end. It was really interesting for students to walk through kind of, does this in the context of his life make sense? And I'm like, well, what about the context of the hungry grizzly bear? So I don't know if I'm answering directly, but you're right that these are examples that can't be found in SCRN. The cougar maybe a little bit, but I think the contact happens, again, not like him touching the cougar, but in this attempt to, again, move his body in a way that would be understood by the cougar in a kind of language. Now, how the cougar sees Michel Serres, we don't know. I mean, some can be deduced by the way that the cougar, whatever noises or movements or kind of circling around. Still doesn't go, I mean, he tries to take that as an example of thinking through human knowledge as embodied, but doesn't spend a lot of time. I think Thomas Nagel walks through kind of what is it like to be a bat. That's just a lot of like an entire text on trying to ask about, can we actually imagine ourselves in the body of another being? Another creature, and I would say depends on the creature, but yeah. Thanks for your question.
Do you want a quick follow-up before we go to Flora?
No.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay,
that was great.
Flora.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. This was very inspirational. And my question would be still on that notion of contact. How much legality would you put in that? Do you think it as something that could be the grounds of legal protection of the animals, or do you think it mostly as a a notion that should be inculcated privately through education. And I was very pleased to hear that you take La Fontaine's fables as really talking about animals and trying to educate us on having a certain sensitivity to animals.
Yeah.
But I'm contrasting that with some recent political debates in France, where there was a debate when the ecological party said that we should not fight against bedbugs or rats, and we should not say that these are harmful animals, but rather that they are liminal or contact animals. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, great question. I was actually just at a conference at Cerise à la Salle on Coq pour la littérature pour le vivant, and there was a woman who was making exactly this argument about bed bugs as liminal creatures. The legality of contact. I'm not sure. I mean, I was thinking about what kind of institutional structures, and I immediately just went to a book by Will Kemlicka and Sue Donaldson. It's called Zoopolis, and basically they set up this legal structure, kind of 3 different categories of animal. You have the pets that live with us that should be given, they're citizens, they should be considered citizens and have the same types of rights to moving in and out of spaces, rights to be fed, rights to be protected. Then they create the category of denizens. So that would be raccoons, birds outside. And they set up a whole other legal structure. And then you have sovereigns. So those would be the wild animals, and they just need to be left alone and protected. Now, I don't think, I was trying to think through contact in terms of those 3 kind of categories. But part of me was, given I'm a literary scholar, and I think I'm more interested in the way that it doesn't fit into those categories and requires its own literary genre of kind of writing, so a kind of storying. And this is what I come back to in Serre's work, is that he's constantly struggling with, how do I create the theoretical framework for what I'm talking about, and how do I make this about individual stories? And I think part of me wants to say that contact is going to require, even reading Val Plumwood, like the fact that it took her over 15 years to write about being prey, and she kept saying as a philosopher, like, I couldn't find the words, I couldn't explain how this had happened to me, or even what this was like as a human being. I guess I would say that for me, it's there's more possibilities in contact as requiring storytelling and a really strong imaginary element, like a really strong imaginary element. So yeah, I had this discussion with students the other day about kind of surrealism, realism, and magical realism, and what are the possibilities of those different ways of storytelling to art, again, to kind of illustrate or bring alive these forms of animal-human context.
I know there are more questions in the room, but I think we do need to move on to the next paper. I think the fact that there are so many questions is just testimony to how productive and fruitful this paper has been. So I'm sure everyone would want to join me in thanking very much our presenter, Stéphanie Posthumus. Thank you.